is your Classic Metal Show right here on the ClassicMetalShow.com. That, of course, was Iron Maiden from the Power Slave release. That is Flash of the Blade. And on the line and on the video right now as well, waking me up very early this morning, I think, is the early riser himself, the author of so many great books. And the book we're going to talk about, or one of the books we're going to talk about, is this one right here, Where Eagles Dare. It is the book about Iron Maiden in the 80s. And, of course, he is the great author himself, Mr. Martin Popoff. Martin, how are you, sir?
Hey, I'm doing all right, man. Thanks for having me, Chris. Very
sure,
cool.
Man. Well, dude, before we dig into the books, man, and I know I've said this to you before, but I am, as a writer that is in no way as prolific as you. I've written 6 books in 6 years, which I'm very impressed myself with 6 books in 6 years. And I know you have to look at me and be like, 6 books, 6 years, I'd be broke.
Exactly. Yes, I definitely have to move much faster than that.
Yeah, it is a testament to you, man. I don't know how you do it, because I know for me, when I start writing, I'll write for a while and I'll have all these ideas going and I'm flowing and words are just coming out of my head and through my hands. And then it gets to a point where I'm just writing words and none of it is story anymore. And I don't know how you have that kind of focus to not let that happen and write such compelling books, man. You do such a great job of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things I definitely have to do as I get older is use that ABC priority time thing. So I have to write between like 8 and noon, because I really don't write anything probably afternoon, sometimes in the evening if I get a good groove on. But, I think you got to just keep going. And once I'm into a book, there's that big problem with, if I leave it for too long, I lose enthusiasm. I lose track of where I am. I lose track of like really being soaked in that band's catalog. So once I get started, I just basically say, I gotta keep going and get this thing finished.
Sure. With the books that you write, because they are so complete, for lack of a better term, do you have to script everything out? Like when you wrote the Iron Maiden, do you write down like every album and then the points that you want to make and then go back and fill in? Or are you just one of those that just kind of has a general idea and then just write to that idea?
Yeah, actually, and I think this is probably the only time I've ever really sort of said this in this much detail, but I literally now, with all these books, that if it's a book on one band, I chart out a chapter and I call it like Peace of Mind Mainframe. And what I do is I put writing, in 36 point in a Word document, writing, recording, album cover, and then I list all the songs, and then I put aftermath/reviews, and then I put tour, and then literally slot in everything I have under all of those headings, so I don't get all boggled in my mind, and I just know, okay, so I'm just talking about, they haven't gone into the studio yet. I'm just talking about the lead up to the album, the writing of it, where maybe that's at some rehearsal studio somewhere. So literally this half a page is really only about this, and I don't have to think about anything else, any specific songs. I've slotted that material into the songs, and then I go through every album essentially song by song.
No kidding, man. Wow, that's a lot of work. That is.
Well, like I say, it keeps you organized, and it makes you be able to be dumber about the whole thing. You don't have to keep. It's not like a 4-dimensional chess game at that point. It's literally just move from point A to point B. Just keep going, and then once it's all done, maybe it's not perfect, but later when I come back to the edit, I'm going to read it and add in more stuff.
Right. Has writing books taken away your love for the music, Eddie? Because I know I used to, years ago, I used to own a music magazine. And when I owned the music magazine, I got to the point where I couldn't listen to music for a little while, just because I wrote and wrote and wrote about it, to where it was like, oh, Jesus, it's work. Have you been able to maintain that? Or do you have periods where you just like, I don't want to listen to UFO anymore because I've written so much about it, and you just kind of get away from it for a year?
That absolutely totally happens. By the time I'm through a book, I can't listen to that band anymore because it reminds me of work. Like right now, I've got 3 big long Rush books that have been long finished that are coming out over the next 2 years. And Rush is a band that I just can't listen to for pleasure anymore. It just reminds me of work because that'll be my 6th Rush book by the time the last one comes out, right?
Sure. Now you mentioned Rush, and you're obviously once again working on Rush. No secret the big news about Neil passing away. When that happens, and you, somebody that has met all these guys and knows a lot of these guys, at least on a superficial level, how do you continue to write and avoid letting the emotional, sadness, for lack of a word, come into the writing itself? Because I mean, you've obviously written about guys that have passed away before, and I have to imagine, just like everybody else, nobody was listening to Rush a month and a half ago, or not, and now all of a sudden everybody's listening to Rush once Neil passed away. Does that change at all how you approach, or do you have to fight with yourself not to let the immediacy of the emotion change the history that you're, documenting?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting case because I did a episode of my new podcast, History in 5 Songs, with Martin Popoff on Neil, and then I went on a radio show, Columbus, Ohio, classic rock station, and talked about Neil, and I helped a guy with an obituary on Neil, but I never wrote one myself. And we've decided we really are not changing any of the first Rush book that is due out in May. It's called Anthem Rush in the 70s, but I am going to have to write about later. I mean, the really odd case for me was the Motorhead book, because when I wrote that Motorhead book, all 3 guys were alive. And by the time it was like starting to go through an edit, all 3 of them were dead. So that was pretty bizarre. I essentially wrote this Motorhead book, and nobody had died. I mean, it was just basically, I'm writing a book on the early days Motorhead bands, because it literally it ends at the end of Iron Fist, that Motorhead book I wrote. So it's the classic lineup, right? And then they all started going, and I kind of knew these guys a little bit. Like I'd interviewed them, especially Fast Eddie. Interviewed him many times. Sure. Great guy, and it's pretty odd. But I eventually, like I say, with Neil, I never had to write anything on him. I just did an episode of the podcast, and it's a super sad situation because he leaves behind a wife and a daughter, and obviously he had the earlier tragedies as well. And then, you hear Sully from Godsmack saying that he was in pretty rough shape for months, was in a wheelchair and couldn't talk, I think is what he said.
Right.
I often wondered if he kind of might have got his hand slapped a little bit for adding that a little bit of, private stuff that maybe he shouldn't have. I don't know. I'm wondering. It was a pretty sad situation and total shock. I mean, he's just not a guy you think of as passing, right? He's the big strong medicine man on his motorcycle, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, it definitely was a shock when he passed, because he's one of the rare few that, for as popular as Rush was, maintained an absolute level of privacy. I know, I just recently watched the Rush documentary that's on Netflix, and I didn't even realize that he took off for a year and a half and jumped on his motorcycle and just kind of rode all around the continental Americas for 2 years or something. It really, it's a testament to a guy in a band that big that he was able to, disconnect for a while. It just doesn't happen that way anymore.
Yeah, well, it's funny. You talk about the privacy, and one thing I always found amusing is that, okay, so early on, Neil would do lots of interviews, and he was great at it, and he was great at explaining his lyrics. He was always a great interview, right? And He would talk your ear off kind of thing. But after he had his tragedies, with his daughter and his wife dying, he definitely withdrew, and he wasn't the guy at the meet and greets and stuff. But it's almost like he said, okay, you know what? I'm gonna be open and out there for the world my own way. And so he wrote stacks and stacks of books. It's essentially the ultimate Neil Peart interview. And really, at the end of the day, he's actually been more open and more quote unquote interviewed than Geddy and Alex have, simply by pouring his whole life into these books that he wrote.
No question. Well, Martin, let's talk about the most recent books that you've done. And I mean, like we said at the beginning, you're so prolific. The latest one that I've read is Where Eagles Dare, the Iron Maiden in the 80s. And, as complete can be of, basically the glory days of Iron Maiden, you know, it's such a weird thing with Iron Maiden because people seem to have forgotten, at least in my eyes, that the 80s, while it was definitely their biggest time, obviously their glory days musically, it wasn't always the biggest time for them commercially. I would say they're much more commercially viable now, maybe not with the releases, but the touring. I as an example, I saw Iron Maiden here in Cleveland play a show. It was them and Testament, and it was at an 18,000 seat outdoor venue, and they maybe sold 1,000 tickets. I mean, and that was in that time period. That was like probably Fear of the Dark, I think, would have been the timeline for it. But people forget that Iron Maiden had a real downturn as well at the end of the 80s. I'm sure they're a huge band, but I think people have forgotten that. Do you see that people forgot that it hasn't been this long, glorious ride for them?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple of narratives there, and one is, yes, I mean, there is the decline. They essentially start the decline really at somewhere in time, Seventh Son, and then it's even lower around No Prayer and Fear of the Dark, and then it's even lower. I mean, I remember seeing them in a club with Blaze, right? Mm-hmm. Here in Toronto, they were playing clubs. It's quite a parallel to the Judas Priest story, and then they come back. But the almost the more interesting thing, and I've never really even thought about this, is there's the glory period and the time when they were insanely big. Let's say 83 to about 86, right? Oh, sure. But the type of big they are now, it's almost like as adults, they've probably learned to even have more creature comforts. And, that thing about sick and tired of being tired, they're not hung over all the time and worrying whether they have drinking problems and stuff. And they're flying around on a jet that Bruce is flying. And, they probably worked out all the kinks to have a really good life, and they're confident in their own skin now. So right now, I think no question, they are traveling in way more comfort, put it that way, touring wise, than they ever did in 84, 85. But obviously the thing is they're selling way, 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 way less records now, but that almost doesn't matter. So it's almost like their fame and richness and comfort now is way different than it was back then. And also, I guess if you think about it, all that money from the glory years, they still have. Right. Well, they make more money, but in the glory years, they were only making their first money, and still a lot of it was being poured back into recouping and poured back into the show. So even when they, to all of us, mortals and peons, they probably looked super crazy rich. They probably weren't super crazy rich. Sure. They were only super crazy famous, essentially. And even then, they were kind of, they were big, but they were still a cult band. They were still a heavy metal band, right? Sure. So yeah, it's funny to think about it. They're probably way more well off now than they ever were, and they're probably way more comfortable now than they ever were, and they're probably in better health than they even were back then.
Sure. Do you think, and this is not I'm gonna make a statement based on what I hear from people, and it's not necessarily an opinion I agree with, because I love a lot of the newer stuff. Not the last two records, but I've from Brave New World up, I've pretty much liked stuff a lot more than most people. But I'm curious if you think that, the fact that they've transitioned, like we're saying, into a more comfortable band, do you think that has affected the amount of care and amount of time and creativity that they put into new music? Because most people think, you ask most people and they're like, yeah, Iron Maiden musically since Brave New World, they're not really into it a whole lot. People will tell you about that they don't like Dance of Death, and they haven't heard anything really great since the old days. I don't necessarily agree with the point, but I understand it is a different sound now. It is definitely a more theatrical, they have enough money that they could stay in the studio and record 8 and 9 and 10-minute songs, and and Steve Harris can do whatever he wants creatively. Do you think that comfort has changed either what they hear or the fire that they have to write music?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I would agree with some of that and disagree with some of that. I mean, it's true that probably the big difference is that they they don't write short songs anymore, right?
Right.
I mean, they do, but I mean, they're known for these really long songs, and I think I actually probably prefer. See, I'm probably going to do a third book. So after Where Eagles Dare, there was Holy Smoke, Iron Maiden in the 90s, and still got some of those. But I'm probably going to do a third one. I'm going to probably call it Wildest Dreams or Empires of the Clouds, something like that. Right. Iron Maiden in the 2000s. And I'm going to enjoy doing that work or doing that book more than I enjoyed doing the 90s book, certainly, because I was not a fan of the 90s stuff, even with Bruce, really that much. So right. I think the new records are all recorded better and sound better. So let's put that on the table. I think they're much more listenable than certainly the Blaze albums, and even No Prayer for the Dying, and even Fear of the Dark. I think the material is better than that 90s material, and maybe even better than the tail end of the 80s material. So I'm not having as much of a problem with it. And I probably am a fan of those last two albums even more than the earlier ones, because the earlier 2000s ones. Brave New World is one that a lot of people, I hear Super Maiden fans quietly grousing about a little more than they used to when it first came out. It was so cool when it came out, because obviously Bruce is back and there was a lot of, hurrah about the whole situation, right? But yeah, I mean, there's a comfort level there, but also you got to give it up for them for putting out 5 or 6 studio albums or whatever it is. I mean, that they've actually made a fair amount of new music for a band that, some of these bands more or less, look at Blue Oyster Cult, Metallica is stretching it out a lot. AC/DC stretched it out a lot, even Rush, really. But Maiden has stayed creative enough, and they've gone in there in the shows and insisted on playing a lot of those new songs. So they're trying to stay vital. I mean, there is this British Lion situation, which is kind of odd that Steve's out running around with his young band, really, and playing clubs and stuff like that, which is pretty bizarre. And they've got 2 records out, right? So I tried to get Steve to answer. But I'm scared to tick him off, right? So, I tried to get him to answer. Are you writing or wanting to tour at a whole different rate than the Maiden guys? And it was like, oh no, I love being in Maiden. I love, because usually in this situation, it's like one guy is hot to trot, wants to keep going, and the other guys are just complaining about wanting, they don't want to be on the road, they don't want to make new records. You get every single story from these heritage acts, but no, they're pretty vital, and they're pretty amazing live still. Like I say, they're in really good shape too, right?
Oh yeah, they absolutely are. It's really, and you bring up a great point about them continually writing new records. They're still on the 2.5 year cycle where they pump out a record every 2-3 years.
I think it's probably a lower average than that if you think about it, going back to Brave New World, because I think there's only 6-ish records, right? So and but they're definitely slowing down, and you also hear rumors in the background that that there is this sort of grand retirement plan. Like, they plan everything out, and I think they have an actual plan down on paper that they're really stretching things out.
Right. Do you think that when they do finally call it a day, that you think Bruce will go back to doing solo material, and obviously Steve is doing British Lion. Maybe that is part of his end game, is that he wants to continue, and he's planting the seeds so he doesn't have to go from retiring from Iron Maiden to starting all over again. He'll have at least the seeds planted to, maybe. I don't know. I mean, you would think that Steve Harris has enough money these days that he never has to really start over.
No, and I think this is where you always find out. It's like ex-presidents. That's when you really find out if they were good guys or not. Like, what did they do after they were presidents, right? How engaged did they stay in running America as much as they could, right? And
right.
So you find out who was a selfish bastard and who actually stayed engaged, right? And it's the same with rock and roll. It's like who is who is staying creative because they just love making new music and records. And Bruce is an interesting case because we see a lot of these lead singers as they get older, their voice is degrading badly. But Bruce seems like he still has some more mileage left in it, and he loves music. He's a definite music nerd, so I can see him making records as long as he can.
No question. All right, well, let's transition a little bit. Let's talk about your book. I think it's the latest book that you have out there. Your book on King Diamond. You know, a very different character than Iron Maiden, obviously, although it seems like it's the same fan base. But for King, you know, he is such a you like him or you hate him kind of a guy. And he really has become, I think he's become more iconic as the years have gone by. And yet there's such a love for him that it's always amazing to me. Like, I'll just tell you straight out, I am not a huge fan of King Diamond. I love the music, his voice, you know, I'm one of the miss and the hit or miss guys with his voice. Right. That being said, I understand the love for King Diamond. And, you know, for you as somebody that's, you know, obviously written and researched on him, do you see him growing more as an artist or with the fan base, I guess, to where it used to be such a, oh, I love King Diamond, I hate King Diamond, I love Mercyful Fate, I hate Mercyful Fate, to where now it's just kind of universally accepted that he's one of the greats?
Yeah, I don't think he's going to grow at all, really, as an artist. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, I just think he loves what he's doing, and he's going to stay in this niche and in this lane. I mean, you know, there's some concern that this new album is taking a long time, but it's going to be a King Diamond album. But then there's also the Mercyful Fate touring. Now, what King's opinion has always been, and this could change over time, but his opinion, and he's right about this, is that he can do better financially, you know, for him and his family, which is a family now. He's married and he's got a daughter. A daughter it is. Mm-hmm. So basically, he can do better as King Diamond. So he's always sort of hinted and been adamant, and it's kind of proven to be the case, that he's going to continue with that career rather than the Mercyful Fate career. My book is a Mercyful Fate book. So it's called Black Funeral into the Coven with Mercyful Fate. I haven't done a King Diamond book. I could do a King Diamond book, but I don't think what I think is really cool about what's going on with King is that he's looking amazing right now. He's still singing fine, but he's got his look down perfect. It's almost like the way he's almost adjusted a little bit into this whole sort of standard look that you know, this perfectly clean look that Ozzy has gone into, but Ozzy doesn't look right in this new look, right? But King looks amazing, and I think there's a lot of excitement around King because he's looking great, he's singing great, he's touring a lot still, he's recovered from his heart issues. Mm-hmm. So I think what's cool with King is that he's becoming, as you say, way more accepted as an icon, and people are just going to have to accept him, falsetto and all. But I think he's literally becoming like a Lemmy. He's literally becoming, and you know, in a way, Alice, Ozzy, Kiss, Lemmy, King, they're all Blackie Lawless. They're all kind of cartoon characters in a way. Right. And so he is this cartoon superhero guy in a way. And then, yeah, he has this eccentricity about the overt Satanism and the eccentricity about the voice. But I think basically he's becoming accepted as one of the greats, as one of the icons. And it's almost like we've subtly shifted into a point where whatever this new King Diamond touring is, and the record and the Mercyful Fate touring, is like this great victory lap of acceptance.
Sure. Do you think with King and with obviously Mercyful Fate, but even with Iron Maiden, you know, do you think that a big reason that these guys are shifting into icon status or legendary status has a lot to do with the fact that there have not been in the last 20 years, it's really looking at now, since even like a Korn or something, I guess, would probably be the end. There really hasn't been anybody in for a really long time that has kind of carried the torch in a big way. There's a lot of great bands, but they're all club bands. You know, they're not 10,000, 18,000 seat selling bands anymore, which has almost given almost a false impression to people that the guys that did it before were larger than life. Do you see that or no?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I always try to not be closed-minded and think about our hard rock heavy metal world and realize that there are massive bands out there. But now that I think about it, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking we have had a lot of circumstances where some massive bands have gone away due to drugs or death or whatever. I mean, we kind of lost Pantera. We lost, Alice in Chains they became kind of a smaller thing. Pearl Jam kind of just withdrew, and the idea of not doing a lot of interviews and not doing a lot of records, they've like made themselves an insular cult band. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Slipknot has always had their problems, but they're still a massive band. So there's an example of where I almost feel like we would be closed-minded to think Slipknot are not like the Iron Maiden for a different generation. Right. I mean, there are still these massive bands that go out there and can still play huge, huge shows. You think of Killswitch and
you run out of names. That's it.
I suppose you do. Yeah. And I suppose there's a lot of big bands, like I say, in the non-heavy metal world, which I even know kind of less about. But yeah, I mean, Pantera always comes to mind as the one that, platinum albums all through the 90s, playing extreme metal when all heavy metal was dead.
Right.
But then, they basically self-imploded due to fighting with each other and drugs, right. I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Slipknot, and you're right. Slipknot is still obviously huge, but even Slipknot debuted in '99. That's already 20 whatever years ago. They're really the last. I honestly think the last big one was Korn.
Yeah.
There's really nothing. I mean, yeah, Killswitch is a great band, but Killswitch isn't selling 18,000 tickets at a per venue. Yeah. There really hasn't been anybody to take the mantle and grow. And I honestly think that's why there's so much more interest in nostalgia these days. You take take hair metal. There hasn't, there's bands out there that do hair metal type stuff, your Crash Diets and whatnot, but they're a club band, and that's why you have a stadium tour with Def Leppard and Motley Crue, because there's been nobody to come in and replace those bands. It's amazing that it has that staying power, but at the same time, it's sad because you can literally see the finish line coming.
Well, and the other thing that we're forgetting about is there are, exponentially more bands every decade than there used to be. So it's crowded and they're splitting those tickets. You mentioned the Killswitch situation. So basically it's way easier to make a record now.
Right.
You can make a record in your bedroom, or it's just much cheaper. I mean, back to the 70s, every single record was made in a very big, expensive studio with a big producer, right? So we didn't even have an indie scene in the 70s, believe it or not, right? Indie kind of started with punk and then the new wave of British heavy metal, and then you had then when we were all doing our stuff in the 90s, there were all these medium-sized to small labels that put out a lot of stuff. But so ironically, there's way more bands and way more records, but I say ironically because music is free now. Music is essentially free, so it's really bizarre, like recorded music. There's nothing attached to that. So back to the old days, there were way less bands, and just if you were a band, your whole industry was way bigger because there were trucks driving around delivering plastic and paper all over the place, right? It was just a bigger industry. There were a lot more dollars being, changing hands because of physical product, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy how it has changed, and and it hasn't only changed in music. I know for me with my books, I get hounded, and I've done a couple books where I've done book on, or audio books. And I have to imagine, for you, do you see a difference in how many people are buying books, and do you feel the demand where people are starting to ask you to do audio books with your books?
Yeah, I've been doing ebooks for a long time, and those tick over okay. And I've actually done a few audiobooks right here in my office. Reading them in myself. I've done 3 or 4 of those, and I've done a bunch of short documents. Plus, some of my bigger books through publishers, they've gone out and got audiobooks done of them. The Motorhead was done in audio, and I think the Rush is going to be done in audio, all these 3 Rush books. So yeah, that's happening a lot. I just read an article that said print books are still maintaining, and that business is, you know, to everyone's surprise, still growing. Ebooks has dropped 10-15%. Audiobooks was all the rage, and people are talking about audio, but it's kind of flatlined a little bit. But people still love audio, and at the same token, what they're saying is it is kind of an exciting time for podcasts as well, right?
Sure.
So people are figuring out a way to obviously engage with the spoken word on their phones or in their cars or whatever, and that is audiobooks and podcasts. So yeah, that one is a little bit in flux, but for some reason they say ebooks has kind of plateaued and dropped a little, and then print is still good, because obviously I think it's the same reason, you know, I've always said is that you can only spend so much time staring at a screen,
Sure.
so people will still get print books.
Sure. And, you know, like I said, I've done a couple of audiobooks at this point. And the one thing I do like about the audiobooks is it really does leave you a freedom to add extra content that you just didn't have, you know, space, or it didn't match what you were doing exactly. I know with both of the audiobooks that I've done so far, you know, I wrote, one of the books was on the Motley Crue self-titled 94 record. The other one was on the Judas Priest Turbo. And what was really nice was that I was able to attach interviews with an interview with John Corabi and an interview with KK Downing as a nice little side piece. You know, neither necessarily fit the what I was writing about, but it was still a nice little bonus for people that were buying the book, that they could hear KK Downing talk for a half hour about Turbo, or hear John Corabi talk about the 94 record. You know, that it is a nice way to give the fans a little bit more, which I guess just adds value to the product itself.
Yeah. Have you read your audiobooks yourself?
Oh yeah, I hate it.
So do you like, does your mind wander and you start talking about stuff yourself and adding your own content as you're going? Depends how much drinks you have, I suppose.
Yeah,
when you're
well,
right?
I've done it that way, and my mind definitely does, is because, you know, a lot of the stuff that I write, like you're more research oriented, where a lot of the stuff that I write is I go song by song, but I have a lot of personal stuff, like a personal story about where I was when I heard this, or something I did when I heard that I add into the books. So yeah, my mind definitely does go into that direction, to where I'll be like, well, let me tell you this story as well. And you know, and it's fun. It's fun in that regard. Man, but and I know you've done it yourself, to where you know this. It is awful to sit there and read your own book back, and you just, you know, you don't feel like you phrased something right, or just you feel like you're pacing. You overanalyze.
Worse than that, you see the typos. That's the worst part. Oh man. And you know, my Max Webster book, I realized that one, like, I literally have not put back in print because I spotted so many typos when I was reading it in, right? And it just ticks me off, and I think, oh, all those copies out there have all these typos in them.
I know, it's awful. That's like, you know, I have the 3 music books, which are fairly small. They're all at about 20,000 words. So that's not terrible to do, but you know, my other 3 books, one's about divorce, one's about an industrial
excellent, right? That sold a couple thousand copies, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, the other books have done really well. The divorce book did real well. The Call Me Chris about the burn accident did really well. You know, they both sold in thousands of copies, which is, you know,
awesome, man. Yeah.
Testament to the CMS fans for, you know, paying attention and buying, because I know who buys them, but you know, now that's the thing that I get emails about all the time, is, when are you going to do an audiobook for this? And I'm like, oh my God, so these are like 80, 100. The newest book that I did is like 100,000 words. And I'm like, oh my God, it will take me 6 months to read this well.
Yeah.
You know,
I know exactly how long it takes, because I've read 2 that were 80 to 100, and it takes a little over 10 hours. It's a lot. Your voice is just crapped right out after, right?
Yeah.
As you do a session, right?
Right. And then editing it is, I don't mind doing the reads. I mind doing the edits. Because, you know,
I didn't edit at mine at all. I just went on. No edits. It literally, I would go chapter by chapter, and what you got is what you got.
You must be a better reader than me, because I literally sit there and I'm so meticulous with the reading of it, where I'll read a sentence and I'll be like, nah, I don't like the way I ended that. And then I'll listen back to it and I'll be like, why am I changing this? That wasn't so bad.
I know. How you doing that? Yeah.
It's awful. But
yeah.
well, Martin, one last thing that you're doing that I share with everybody, and I think people should definitely check out that you're doing, is not the books, but as you mentioned earlier, is this podcast. I love this podcast that you're doing. It's a different approach, and I think much like every other medium, whether it's radio or TV or books or whatever it is, you get to a point where there's a saturation point. And I think music podcasts have definitely hit the saturation point, where so many of them are exactly the same. So many of them are, okay, here's band A. They just released new album B. And now let's talk to the band. We'll talk it up for 5 minutes, and then we'll talk to the band for 10, 20, 30 minutes. And then we'll do a wrap up and out. And okay, that's fine if you want to hear about the bands. I love the podcasts. Like I'll make a comparison of your podcast to another podcast of a fellow author, Joel MacGyver, and the Dead Rock Stars podcast that he did, and I think is going to do another season of. It's refreshing to have a different look and a different focus, that rather than just here's musician, let's talk record, and I love your podcast. I wish you would do 2 a week, because it's such a good listen, man.
Yeah. That idea, it literally took me about 10 minutes to come up with that. And the whole thing was, so it's called History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. And we've got 5 30-second clips, and I'm essentially making a point about something using these 5 songs. So I wanted to do something where I wasn't going to interview anybody. I didn't have to schedule anything. I didn't have to worry if my Skype was working or how long it was going to take. If an idea just came to me, walk into the office, I'd just get in and get it done, right? I'd make sure I was excited about something, and I'd do a few notes, but I don't think I've ever spent more than about 20 minutes coming up with, and a lot of that is typing, like just coming up with the notes and picking the clips. I mean, most of that is picking what piece of the song I want to do, but no, I wanted to do something where it was something where I wasn't going to have pod fade. Have you ever heard that term? It means you lose enthusiasm for your podcast, and it goes away. You start doing less and less and less, and then it's gone, right? So I'm up to about 32 of these now, and it's really encapsulated. It's I miraculously, I talk to almost exactly the same amount of time every time. It's between 21 and 25 minutes, and then I'm done, kind of thing. And I'm worn out. I feel like passing out because I talk very fast and I'm animated about it, right? But yeah, it's a cool idea where you could squeeze stuff into it over and over and over again, and hopefully I won't run out of ideas too soon. I have a great Facebook page for it. People give me a lot of ideas. I go with some of them, probably less than half of them I go with, because I see the problem with it all the time, right? And one of the big problems is I want to do it, at least for now, on stuff that I know intrinsically in my heart, off the top of my head, and I don't want to have to do a lot of research and have to memorize a lot of things to be able to do it. So it's all these crazy points that I've always made in talking with fans or fellow music obsessed people, things that have always come up, or theories that I've had or whatever. So yeah, it's just a good little, they're always less than half an hour with the music clips, it seems. And I could see keeping on doing it. A lot of people listen to it, and it allowed me to have a separate Facebook page. I listened to your guys' whole show on dropping social media and Facebook and the problem with it, right? And my big problem with it is it's the only thing I don't even have a cell phone. So I'm not on Instagram. I barely use my Twitter, but I'm really good with Facebook. And I've been at the 5,000 friend limit for years. Sure. I've got 700 extra requests, and that ticks me off so much, because it's the one thing I wish I could keep growing and growing. Well, having this extra page and my public person page has allowed me to, I think I get more action on the History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff group page than I do even on my one that's got 5,000 friends on it, or it just seems the most fresh and exciting. So So yeah, it's like it's allowed me to grow my Facebook in a way.
Sure. Well, you mentioned about social media. You know why it works for you? Because you use it the right way. You're not out there saying, well, here's my dinner and, here's this and here's that. You use it for your professional purpose.
Yeah, we just talk about music. That's it, right?
Yeah.
It's always just about music.
Yeah, which is rare these days on social media. It's such a cesspool in most cases, Well, Martin, obviously, man, you have tons of great stuff. There's always new stuff coming. Tell people where they can go to keep up with you, on social media and then, the website itself so that people can always get the books and they can definitely download the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, basically, my business is being a mail order guy of my own books, whether those are books through publishers or the ones I'm self-publishing. I'm a mail order guy. I'm signing and shipping out books. So you go to martinpopoff.com. They're all described there. There's PayPal buttons for, US, Canada, and international, full descriptions of all the books. Like I say, mail ordering books all the time. And yeah, basically just Facebook. People can email me and ask questions at martinp@inforamp.net. And that's pretty much it. But yeah, my living is essentially the actual selling of my own books. So that's really how I'm able to do this year after year.
Yeah. So buy some books, you cheap fucks. Jesus.
Absolutely.
Nice. Well, Martin, why don't you pick a song from, it could be Iron Maiden or Mercyful Fate or whatever you'd like to wrap this one up with.
Wow. Let's go with some Mercyful Fate, and let's go with Curse of the Pharaohs. An old classic, an absolute classic, and we'll see if we can convert some more people to King's Falsetto.
There we go. We'll see if you get me. Here we go. Check it out. It is Mercyful Fate right here on your Classic Metal Show.